What is up, guys? My name is RJ. This is The Secret Stacks, and I want to start doing more book reviews on my channel. But in particular, I want to start reviewing books that I don't hear other people talking about on BookTube. In particular, some indie books, because I have found some of the most interesting and boundary-pushing stories in indie and self-published works. And to start that off, I'm going to be doing a review of Hell's Children by John L. Monk, which is a post-apocalyptic YA which is right down my alley. When a mysterious virus wipes out anybody older than the age of about 15, then this young 14-year-old named Jack has to pull together a group or gang of friends to help survive and combat some of the more violent and morally bankrupt gangs of kids that have started sprouting up. Maybe this makes me personally bankrupt, but I love these kind of stories where you get kids thrust into just emotionally and physically demanding and challenging situations, and it's a really interesting lens on humanity, especially from the YA perspective, which is why when people say, oh, try to dismiss something just because it's YA, that's why I say it's ridiculous, because it's really a great slice right into the core of humanity. Now, Hell's Children is definitely a spiritual successor of Lord of the Flies, but to me it's a lot more interesting because it's set in modern times, and that presents a really interesting challenge because also the scenario, it's set in essentially suburbia, and it's really cool to see this typically, sleepy part of America get torn to shreds. When I'm evaluating post-apocalyptic stories, it really comes down to a couple key tropes for me. One, like I mentioned before, I really like emotionally challenging and morally ambiguous situations that these characters get themselves in because it's a really interesting reflection on myself and trying to think what I would do if I was forced in this situation. And Hell's Children definitely has plenty of that. And it's even more impactful because of the group of kids that Jack pulls together. And that's the other thing. I really have to care about the characters because I want to really be affected by what happens to them. And John L. Monk does a great job here. It's an interesting and eclectic and just fun group that he pulls together, and not everyone is super competent. Everyone brings a little bit something different, and especially sort of not the main characters, but the sub-main characters they're fun and funny in the ways that they challenge Jack, the main character. And the final thing that I like to look for is, do I learn something, not in terms of the apocalypse, but just in terms of surviving it. I am by no means any sort of prepper. I would definitely not be able to hack it in a post-apocalyptic world, which is why I think in a way it's so fascinating to me, is because it's really interesting to see how characters' minds work and how they work through different problems. And Hell's Children definitely does a great job of presenting problems and dealing with them logically. Nothing seems too out of the box or absurd or things like that. Now, there were only a couple things that I didn't love about the story. One is the main character, Jack, felt almost too competent and too prepared for the apocalypse. His parents were a bit wackadoo in terms of, and there was a good reason for it, but he didn't have a normal childhood growing up, and it really fell into a trope that you see a lot in adult post-apocalyptic stories. It's a really common trope to get this retired ex-military dad who comes together and uses his past life skills to help his family survive. And this is essentially, sometimes feels like the YA equivalent of that. And it leads to a little bit of suspension and disbelief in that you need to really buy into the fact that this 14-year-old is pulling off some of this stuff, and just the way that he thinks. He was homeschooled. He doesn't really interact with other kids in a way that you would normally expect, which makes it interesting, but also I sort of wish that we had a more typical teenage character to get their lens of this world. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is a lower YA in terms of the age range of the characters. Like I mentioned, nobody is older than about 15. So you're not getting a lot of the more emotional relationship dynamics that you get if they were 17 and 18-year-old characters, which, depending on your personal preferences, could be a good thing or a bad thing. Personally, I would definitely be curious to see older characters in this dynamic, just because I think that leads to a little more complexity and a little more conflict. But it was definitely interesting to see the 14 to 15-year-olds. Again, it feels a lot like Lord of the Flies, but just because it's lower YA age characters, it definitely doesn't skip out on any of the real violence that you'd expect in a post-apocalyptic story. So just be prepared for that. But overall, giving this one 4 out of 5 stars. Like I said, really enjoyed it. Very much looking forward to where the series goes from here. Book 2 is going to be out later this year, and it's really as these series grow that I think as you get to know the characters better and the reality of their situation starts to fray at their psyche, I think that's when it gets really cool, and that you start to get more interesting scenarios and interpersonal dynamics within the group. So like I mentioned, post-apocalyptic YA is definitely one of my favorite genres. So let me know down in the comments below if you have any other suggestions that sound similar to Hell's Children. And until next time, see ya.